Hi, Greg.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Not bad.
Okay, let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of the Wright Show, which this is. You are Greg Easterbrook, very well-known journalist and writer. You've written, I don't know, about 10 books, maybe, some
Up to 10,
fiction.
yes.
Exactly
10,
10?
yeah.
Fiction and
I'm up to
nonfiction.
three literary novels, six nonfiction books, and believe it or not, I've written a book of poetry. But don't hold
I
that against
don't
me.
believe it. I don't believe it.
All right.
You gave me the option.
Okay.
I
You don't
choose
have
not to believe it.
Okay.
And which titles do you like to mention, if you can mention a few?
Well, I think my best novel is the current one called The Leading Indicators. It's a contemporary, realistic story. It's what the publishing world calls mid-list, which means no sex scenes and no murders. Sorry, I don't have either of those in that book, but I think any contemporary reader would find it very interesting. I think the Progress Paradox, which came out in 2003, you remember that book? That's about the relationship between prosperity and happiness, is my bestseller. And of my own book, since we're going to talk about theology, my favorite of my own books is a 1998 book that has a terrible title, chosen by me, Beside Still Waters, that's about process theology and different ways of thinking about Scripture. And that's my favorite of my own books.
I don't think that's a bad title. Is that from the Psalms? Besides,
Yes, yes. But since I didn't write the Psalms, I should have come up with a better title.
you're not the first one to steal a title. God forgives you. But we are going to talk about theology and a theological story that has a kind of connection to me because I am currently visiting professor of science and religion at Union Theological Seminary in New York. The person we're going to talk about, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was at Union during his two visits to the United States. He was a German theologian, and the reason we're going to talk to him about him is because you have written a play about him, and you're very interested in him and his theology. And even as we speak, I gather your agent is talking to theaters about producing it. And he's, I only really became aware of him when I went to Union, but he's a fascinating story. He was ultimately, I mean, not to spoil the plot, but ultimately he became part of the resistance to Nazism and was executed for conspiring to assassinate Hitler. And in fact, that all kind of started when he was at Union Theological Seminary for the second time, and he just decided, the war had started, I guess, and he just decided, no, he had to go back and fight the good fight, I guess. So, talk about your interest in him and where you're going with this.
Well, my basic line about Bonhoeffer is this, that in my opinion, the three most accomplished people of the 20th century were Nelson Mandela, Norman Borlaug, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And most American high school students don't even know who two of those three people are. So I've written some on Norman Borlaug, who's a great hero of mine, but Bonhoeffer's another one, so I decided to take a turn writing about him. And I think to the extent that his name is recognizable, many people know that he was part of the resistance against the Nazis, which obviously was an unsuccessful resistance, but was more extensive than I think than generally appreciated. Hundreds of German citizens were executed for opposing Hitler, among them Bonhoeffer, who died young at the age of 39, executed just a couple of weeks before the end of the war when Hitler gave orders to execute. Hitler was basically trying to extinguish any last trace of purity from the German soul and wanted all the remaining good people executed, and he was certainly one of them. But so he's well known for being a resistance figure to Hitler. He's known for being, you often hear him praised, especially among religious conservatives, because he was intensely religious. He was a very great lover of Jesus in every possible way. But I think we don't often hear, or hear at all, about his radical theology. His theology is very different from what the Christian right would recognize today. In fact, I think if Dietrich Bonhoeffer would get himself kicked out of get himself kicked out of any fundamentalist Christian church today, now kicked out of a lot of mainstream churches too for his radical beliefs. And so I'm hoping to call, through my own writing about him, call attention not just to his life story, which is important, of course, but to the things that he believed, which were quite radical.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting that you should call him radical because, and I don't know much about his theology, so I'm looking forward to learning about it. But he did sometimes react against liberal theology, right? I mean, liberal in the technical sense of not necessarily politically liberal, although there is a correlation, but liberal in the sense of the conception of God, a not very old-fashioned conception of God. And I think he sometimes suggested that he thought, that was kind of bloodless. And, when he was in New York, what he loved to do is go to the churches in Harlem where he said, they know how to preach it. This is, let's have some old time religion. So what is it that's radical about his theology?
Well, I think the first step in understanding that, Bob, is if you go back to the times, the 1920s, when Bonhoeffer arrived at the seminary, late 19th century and the early 20th century, German schools of theology were at the vanguard of what we'd now consider leftist thinking and sort of bow wave of historical literary criticism of the Bible, trying to understand the Bible as a story rather than as a revelation, and studying the exact, still today do, but at that time German scholars were big on studying the exact wording of the text to try to figure out what was written at what time and what was added later. You know a lot of this yourself. So he entered the academy in the early 1920s when the most accomplished theologians thought the Bible was a fascinating sociological document, but couldn't possibly be true. And he reacted against that. He believed in the actuality of God, that God was an actual being, and that heaven and hell were actual places, and the judgment day was an actual event. And that was actually considered off the beam sort of thinking in the 1920s. About the educated, probably I would guess that many people at Union Theological Seminary at that time, that if you actually believe that God actually exists, you just haven't studied enough. And Bonhoeffer pretty early on aligned himself with Karl Barth, the famous theologian who was very insistent that God was an actual being who would punish people for their behavior on earth, especially for their involvement in Nazism as it evolved. So that part in his career, he would look to all of us like a very conventionally religious figure. He certainly didn't end up that way.
Okay, so what changed?
Well, I think as thoughts evolved, the situation evolved. Again, to step back a bit first, we think about where Bonhoeffer was a German. Think about where Germany was in the 1930s, sociologically and also in terms of religion. Because of the Vatican's inaction on the Holocaust, we tend to think of as the 12th, the Vatican, the Holocaust. That's what got messed up during the war years. Of course, everything was messed up. But from the religious standpoint, the Lutheran Church was more to blame for the Holocaust than the Vatican was. 70% of Germans were Lutherans when the war began. And the Lutheran Church not only took no action at all against Nazis, it actively embraced them. The Luther Rose, which any of your Lutheran listeners would be familiar with, during the Nazi years was entwined with a swastika. When you went into a Lutheran church, the rose and the swastika were put together. At Lutheran baptisms, the celebrant was supposed to pray to God that the child grow up to become like Hitler. The Lutheran Church was really tied up in the promotion of Nazism, and in part, not to get too far into the details of theology, but they promulgated this intensely destructive idea called cheap grace, that you could, as long as you believed in God and received God's grace, it did not matter how much you sinned on earth, including if you sinned in horrible ways by participating in or failing to oppose murders, that it was fine. You'd go to heaven anyway. This is what Lutheran clergy was preaching during the Nazi years, often with someone from the Gestapo sitting in the audience, of course, to make sure that that's what was preached. But I think many people found this incredibly horrific in theological terms. Bonhoeffer was certainly not the only one. Karl Barth fled Germany after issuing a denunciation of the cheap grace concept in 1934. Martin Niemöller, who would survive the war in a concentration camp and become the head of the World Council of Churches, denounced this concept. A lot of very brave religious people denounced it, but it carried the day. And I think it caused that and many other things that happened in Bonhoeffer's life caused him to totally reassess what Christianity could be like if it could not only fail to oppose Hitler, but actually actively cooperate with him.
Now, Bonhoeffer and others did create a faction, right? I think it was called the Confessing Church or something. It was kind of a somewhat organized resistance within the church. So they did try to band together, but they were in a minority.
It was a small minority. It wasn't successful. It was a great, noble, lost cause. Niemöller and some of the others that you would know from that history also joined the Confessing Church, and using confessing in the old theological sense of the word, they tried to argue against what the Lutheran Church was doing and used the pulpit as a way to get an anti-Nazi message out. They were always small in number. They weren't successful. A lot of them were thrown in jail. A few of them were convicted of anti-Nazi activism and executed ultimately. That happened to Bonhoeffer and a number of members of his family, but at least it was the right attempt. This is a little bit off the track of what we want to talk about, but you think about the theological background of the Lutheran Church. We admire Martin Luther as an intellectual rebel, which he certainly was. He was also a horrible person. He was the one who gave history the phrase "sin proudly." He believed that you could commit any sins you wanted in life because God alone would send you to heaven. That got into the German mind somehow, and it was one of the reasons that Germany was able to perform the horrifying acts it did in the two world wars, is because Germans saw it like that. And the older that Bonhoeffer got, he only reached the age of 39, but as his career went along, he increasingly thought that the horribleness of the cheap grace concept was so deep and so powerful that it had to cause you to fundamentally rethink the way a person thought about God and the church.
Mm-hmm. And this may also be a little deep in the weeds, but I think one reason the Bonhoeffers of that time faced such steep odds is, hadn't there been historically a closer connection between the state and the Lutheran Church than we in the United States would imagine being the case? I mean, I think even before Hitler, I think the state had certain levers of influence over the church.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And of course, you remember, old Europe has a number of what our Constitution would call established churches, and there were established churches early on in the American experiment. They don't exist anymore, but in the same way that the Anglicans or the Church of England, a couple of the Scandinavian countries have official state churches that are state subsidized. The Lutheran Church was very much like that in Germany. And to everyone's woe, everything about that turned out to be awful, among many other things. The odious personal pledge that German military officers had to make to obey Hitler personally, not to obey their duty to the German public, but to obey Hitler personally. Members of the Lutheran clergy took the same oath. They vowed to obey Hitler before God. And that just, when your church is doing that, it's got to cause you to have revolutionary thoughts about, you have to tear the whole thing down and start over again, which is, I think, where Bonhoeffer was at the end of his life.
Okay, so talk about that. Now, I gather, for starters, he must have rejected the doctrine of cheap grace, right?
Oh, yes, sure. And he did preach on it early in his career. Early in his career, he was much more conservative or traditionalist. Maybe traditionalist is the right phrase. And the sola gratia, the theological idea that cheap grace was based on, Bonhoeffer preached it as a clergyman early in his career. And he admitted, to his great shame later in his career, that he preached a lot of Nazi-sounding sermons early in his career about how it was Germany's duty to subjugate the rest of the world, and the German people were divinely chosen to enslave and to rule. And the German word, any of your listeners are German speakers, the German word Markstaat was very important in the theology and the philosophy of the time, and turned out to be important in Nazism. He preached that, and of course he came to regret it very deeply.
Yeah. And then when he did start singing a different tune, there was one incident where he was preaching on the radio, and the halfway it just got a little too radical for the Nazis' liking, and they just cut the broadcast off in mid sermon, I think.
Yes, yeah. The Gestapo jammed him once when he was denouncing cheap grace and the involvement of the Lutheran Church and the National Socialist movement. This would have been 1935, maybe 1936, He was officially banned from preaching, and when he left, left Germany many times as a tourist before the war was approaching. He left Germany in 36, 37, and was at Union Theological Seminary until July of 1939, when he decided that it was his duty to go back to Germany and oppose Hitler, which ultimately cost him and a lot of other people their lives.
And where do the ideas you consider so radical take shape? Is it when he's in the United States or when he's in Germany, or both?
Both. He did a fair. Bonhoeffer is best known for his book, The Cost of Discipleship, but he wrote half a dozen books, including one that was a book of practical advice on being a righteous person, that was actually a bestseller and before the Nazi era began, and that he used to fund a lot of his activities later. In that you will find, to me, his key notion is the notion that humanity will be better off if organized religion ceases to exist. That if we are righteous on an individual basis, but if we no longer have organized religion. That was the end point of his thought in his writings. While he was back in Germany during the war, pretending to be an agent of German intelligence in order to avoid either going to jail or being conscripted, and writing and hiding his books. His book Ethics, his final book, which he wrote in manuscript form and had to hide in the attic so the Gestapo wouldn't find it. Imagine living in a place where you have to hide writings in praise of Jesus. Well, that's what it was like in Germany during the war. Concludes that organized religion, the world would be much better off and much more mature without organized religion, and that the controlling thought we should use going forward is, Bonhoeffer is well known for his statement, not to act is to act. Another similar, less known and just as important epigram from his theology is that we should live before God as if there is no God. That we should live on the assumption that nobody's going to judge us, that there's no person with flowing hair sitting on a throne giving us orders, that we make our own moral judgments, and then ultimately we either impress or fail to impress the divine. He thought that was a better organizing principle for human action.
Now, flesh that out a little, because I was watching this documentary about him not long ago, and I think I remember them saying that his view of ethics is that what's right is whatever God wants you to do. But it sounds like you're saying that he wanted you to think about what's right almost in the absence of a conception of God, which so I'm sensing a paradox here somewhere.
Well, the phrase "we should live before God as if there were no God" is one of those phrases that takes you a while to think about it. It's got to really sink in. What's he trying to say here? And I think, yes, his answer to an ethical question is, don't ask what the state wants you to do. Don't ask what your family wants you to do. Ask what God wants you to do. But you do that because it's right, not because there's some tablet written somewhere that tells you this is what you have to do. I find it a very deep and subtle thought, but I got to admit it took me a while to get my head around it too.
Yeah. So, what's the advantage from his point of view for a Christian of thinking about right and wrong as if there were no God judging you?
Well, I'll answer that by way of analogy by citing another one of his writings. An important epigram of his to me is the short phrase, "In the end, everything must become love." Okay, so what does that exactly mean? He often quoted the famous verse from 1 Timothy that the short phrase, "God is love." And I think his writings about this are somewhat, they can be argued, but my interpretation of them is that he thought that what that verse told you is that God literally is love. Not that God advocates love or favors love or hopes that you love, but that literally what God is love. And so if you ask yourself, what is God? What is God in the literal sense? What God is in the literal sense is love. And to me, that's a radical notion. It's a notion of a different way for people to live together. And you can say, well, that actually sounds like the sort of stuff that Jesus taught 2,000 years ago. And I think, yeah, it does kind of sound like that stuff.
So flesh that one out for starters. So to think that God is love, is that to say that, well, when I feel love for another human, that feeling inside me, that is God, And that's all God is? I mean, wherever there is love, there is God, and that is the extent of God? Because that sounds like a very liberal conception of God, and you have said that certainly at one point he was far from theologically liberal.
Well, but see, my feeling is that toward the end he was not just liberal but a radical. I think he was radical toward the end.
Did he drop his anthropomorphic conception of God? The idea of God as a being out there that can be angry and dissatisfied with you and so on?
I think he would tell you that, obviously, we wish we could have this question answered, but I think he would tell you that God literally is love, that's what God is, but that doesn't mean our Zeus conception of the divine of sitting on a mountain somewhere. That's not less than the Zeus conception. That's more than the Zeus conception. It's much more powerful, because ultimately it's more powerful than the armies of the world. It's more powerful than physical forces. If you're looking for something that's transcendent, that has redemptive power, you don't want jet engines or radios or televisions they're not transcendent, they're just material things. You think about something that's transcendent. He was talking about love as a transcendent power, as being more important than other forces of earth or of nature. Mm-hmm. To me, that's a radical view, but one that Jesus would feel very comfortable with.
Yeah. I would say, I mean, you said earlier something to the effect that, there were theological liberals, back in Bonhoeffer's kind of conservative phase, there were theological liberals, including some perhaps at Union, who would laugh at you if you said God existed. I don't think there were. I think there were, I mean, they may have believed in their hearts God didn't exist, but I think they all had a way of defining God, right? I mean, liberal theologians, they might say God is the ground of being, which for my money is a little too abstract. But just to admit to clear conception, I mean, or they might say God is love, which is a pretty liberal notion, but is easier to wrap your mind around in a sense, and easier to see the moral valence of than to say that God is the ground of being. So anyway, okay, so that's. Now there must be. I mean, he certainly is not alone. At least today, is not the only person who has said. Well, as you said, it's in the Bible. But I mean, among theologians who have made that the very core of their conception of God, he's not alone.
Not alone at all. No.
Was it less common when he was doing it?
Was it less common? I'd have to think about what the proper answer to that question is. But I think he was relatively unusual in making that point of view at that time.
Mm-hmm. And when you call that radical, is it radical in conception relative to other conceptions, or is it more that it's radical in the kind of enactment, in abiding by that conception of God?
Well, it caused him to think. He's certainly not the only person in history to have essentially deliberately murdered himself. Many people have done that, and when I say murdered, I mean in the good sense of I will give up my life for something admirable. He's not the only person. Thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people have made that choice. But it caused him to make that choice. I mean, he was in the United States in 1939, just before the invasion of Poland. The war hadn't actually begun yet, but everybody knew that it was about to begin. And he got on one of the last ships on the way to Europe, passenger ships, and said, I'm going back. And if it costs me my life, then that's the cost. And not many people gave their lives fighting Hitler because they were stuck in Germany and had no choice. He had a big choice to make, and he made it a very significant moral choice at a time when other members of his church were making the wrong choice in a major way.
Yeah. Now, do you, so you wrote a whole play about him. Do you have any thoughts about any formative influences in his life that disposed him in this direction? I mean, I think his family, he was from a somewhat eminent family, right? I mean,
yeah.
And they had Jewish friends, right?
They did, and he helped smuggle a few of them out of Germany during the war. Not a huge number, but he was successful smuggling a few out. His brother, one of his brothers-in-law, had a Jewish father, if I remember that correctly. I didn't obsess about that aspect of his life. But I would say that his formative influences certainly were Karl Barth when he was at Union Theological Seminary. Tillich and Niebuhr were there at the same time. So in the same building all at once were Bonhoeffer, Tillich, Niebuhr, and Henry Sloane Coffin. That's the greatest conjunction of theologians since the early Christian era. They all had big effect on him. I think his university professors influenced him a lot. His brother Klaus, who was a very intelligent man, a pretty strident communist, but a great guy, had a big influence on him. He loved his brother very deeply. I think there are a lot of important influences in his life, but in the end, it was his conception of God that drove him.
Yeah, and just to dwell on that conjunction of kind of theological talent and prominence, I mean, people may not appreciate it today, but, Paul Tillich and Reinhold Niebuhr alone, this was a time when religion was a significant enough force among elites that a theologian could wind up on the cover of Time magazine. It was also a time for our younger viewers when being on the cover of Time magazine was almost like being elected president. It was like amazing. Right. And both Tillich and Niebuhr were on the cover of Time magazine independently. I think one of them more than once. I mean, these were major figures in American intellectual life. And then Henry Sloane Coffin was probably at that point president of Union, wasn't he? Or
he was president of the Union Theological Seminary, and Henry Sloane Coffin was on the cover of Time magazine, 1926. So that crew was treated then the way we treat Rihanna and Beyonce today. And we can say, well, that was back in the good old days when people were more serious than they are today. But also the establishment of that time was much more religious than today's establishment is. If you mean the intellect sort of New York, Washington, Boston establishment. Henry Sloane Coffin's a great example. He was a kind of person who's completely disappeared from American public life, and he was an evangelical socialist from a great old money family. He went to Yale. He was a member of Skull and Bones. He couldn't possibly have been more established. Sure, he belonged to whatever the best club of New York City was at that time. And he was an evangelical, and he was a socialist. And you'd have to look pretty hard to find somebody like him in American public life today.
Now, was it him or his son who became chaplain at Yale?
That was his nephew.
His nephew. Okay.
Yeah.
So that was during the Vietnam period. His nephew was a very pretty left-wing chaplain of Yale during the Vietnam era. Okay, now, first of all, it's kind of, it's almost, when you know his story, it's almost surprising that there has not been a true dramatization of his life, either in film, aside from documentaries, or on the stage. And I know you said there's been, I know you're the man, you're doing it, but it's almost surprising it hasn't been done before. I mean, I know there's been a staged reading of his writings and so on.
Yes, there have been several staged readings, and they're very good, by the way.
But it's such a natural story. I mean, it's heartwarming, it's tragic. He's a super intense guy. There's a fairly thorough record of things. Because these were, when he's in the United States, for example, he's writing a lot of letters. His reflections are well preserved. His letters from prison are well preserved. So it's
good scholarly writing. Bob Charles March of the University of Virginia has done great scholarship on him, and one of several. He's only one of several.
So talk a little. I know you don't want to. There may be limits on how much you want to say about what you're doing with this play, but talk a little about. Deciding to try to dramatize it, and how you did it, what kinds of choices you made, and what you chose to emphasize, and so on.
Oh, okay. Yeah, happy to do that. Well, a core choice I made because Bonhoeffer, by the end of his life, was such an intense person and such an intense moment of horror, as bad as it's ever been in human history. I didn't want to just show that. So I begin when he's living in Barcelona. The first act is Barcelona in 1929. He's living in Barcelona and his brother is visiting. And he's a young gadabout. He gets drunk a lot. He goes to clubs. He listens to music. He's a happy man. It's 1929. The Depression hasn't begun. The Nazi movement hasn't begun. His parents are wealthy and his father was a very accomplished psychiatrist. At that time, that was a very high prestige profession in Germany. And he expected to live a life of ease, giving sermons and traveling and drinking champagne and that. And so the first act is about him as a happy young man hearing the first sounds of the approaching horror. The second act is said at the Union Theological Seminary in July of 1939, maybe the only theatrical act ever said in the office of Henry Sloane Coffin. That act happens in his office, with him talking to Coffin and others about the fact that the world is getting so much more serious and what it forces you to think about theology and politics both, because Christians were arguing the extent of their political responsibilities as the war approached. And I should say the play is faithful to history in the same way that the play Inherit the Wind, all your listeners would know, is faithful to history that's based on an event, but the lines that I put in the mouths of characters, I don't claim that they were actually said them, with the exception of a few things that are quoted directly from Bonhoeffer's writing. So unlike that, there's at least one play in circulation that's entirely quotations of things that Bonhoeffer wrote himself and wrote about him. It's a very good piece of work, but this is very different from that. The third act, go ahead.
Well, go ahead. Maybe you'll answer my question. Proceed.
The third act is set in Germany in November of 1942, just as the German invasion of southern France begins, and as it's becoming clear to everyone that the war is going to last far longer than expected. And in that act, I introduced a guy named Wilhelm Canaris, who was a historical figure, is not well known to most Americans. He was the head of the German intelligence service, who actually was a very active anti-Nazi, and was executed with Bonhoeffer on the same day in the same concentration camp at the end of the war. And I introduced a French resistance leader, Simone Michel Levy, partly because I just want to have a woman in the play. And there's a lot of, the Nazi story is mainly a male story, so I wanted an important female character. So the third act is that. And the fourth act is in his cell in the concentration camp the morning of his execution.
Do you make much of his relationship with Barth, Karl Barth? Because that I gather they had he left Germany and encountered, this had been a super important, I guess mentor-like figure to him.
Yes.
Again, a conservative theologian who early on had shaped Bonhoeffer's thinking. Then, as you said, Barth left the country. They encountered one another, I believe, outside of the country, right?
They did. But after a thing called the Barmen Declaration in 1934, it's led by Karl Barth, denouncing the Lutheran Church for participating in the Nazi horror. This is in 1934, when you could still travel to and from Germany in most cases. Barth was a Swiss citizen, so he fled Germany to avoid prison and lived in Basel for the rest of his life. Bonhoeffer frequently went to visit him, and even once World War II began, when Bonhoeffer was on paper an agent of German intelligence, that is, this guy Wilhelm Canaris had given him a good cover story to allow him to move around and keep him from being arrested or conscripted. It didn't last forever, but it worked for a while. He was able to use a German military passport to go to Switzerland and visit Barth on several occasions, and he had to maintain his own cover. He had to pretend to have become a Nazi operative. He was never able in his life to tell Barth what was really going on, and Barth was furiously angry at him. But imagine having your mentor think that you've gone over to the bad side, and you know yourself that you're risking your own life to fight the bad side, but you can't tell the guy that you admire most in life what you're really doing. You have to pretend to be a Nazi to him. That's what Bonhoeffer did.
Right.
Imagine that.
And I gather a key role he was playing in the resistance and the plot to assassinate Hitler was that because he could go abroad, I guess. He conveyed the word to, I think, a guy named George Bell. I'm not sure, but he conveyed the message to someone. He made overtures because the people who wanted to assassinate Hitler, I think, were looking for assurances of support from the Allies. I think, for one thing, they were probably thinking, look, if we kill Hitler, it'd be nice if we were allowed to govern Germany, if they could leave Germany in the hands of right-minded Germans who had done this thing, rather than it be an unconditional surrender where they come, take over our country. So I think they were putting out overtures about like, well, if we kill Hitler, what kind of arrangement can we have with you afterwards? And I gather that Bonhoeffer was, for one thing, involved in that, right?
Yes, because he was able to travel outside Germany, especially to Spain and Switzerland. He often met with English and American spies, and of course, this was treason from the standpoint of Germany. He did lots of things that were treasonous, but he did so with a moral conscience. And that little detour in the story is interesting in itself, because he certainly, Bonhoeffer was not the only one, but many people who were involved in the two main conspiracies to kill Hitler wanted an agreement in place with the Allies, exactly as you say, and the Allies rejected that. They were not interested in making any deal with the killers. If they just wanted Hitler dead and that they were going to go about their business, they never made them any offer.
Right. No, they said, I forget if it was Churchill or some lesser British statesman, said something like, they should do it as a matter of conscience. I mean, it's their job. I mean, it's their duty to kill him, and we don't have to cut a deal. Now, as it happened, they tried to kill him, even without those assurances. There were a couple of attempts, and the famous one, of course, the bomb actually went off, but wasn't close enough to Hitler. It was in the same room. And I guess it was in the wake of that they rounded up a bunch of people, including Bonhoeffer.
Yeah, well, actually, Bonhoeffer was already under arrest when that happened, but he was on arrest on a technicality. He had been accused of avoiding conscription, which was technically not true, because he had an assignment from the German intelligence service. After the bomb plot failed, then the charges against him became more serious. And at that point, he was doomed, and Canaris was doomed, and Beck and lots of all the others who tried to get rid of Hitler. And one of the things that happens in the fourth act of this play, I imagine Bonhoeffer and Canaris in the same cell summing up their work. Now, I don't think that ever physically happened. I think they were in different cells, but that's what goes on in the second half. In the second half of the fourth act of this play, is they come to terms with the fact that the assassination attempt on Hitler actually made the situation in Germany worse, because it gave Hitler an excuse to execute all the professional members of the military and leave the government in the hands of zealots. And it gave Hitler the delusion of the final year of his life that the reason the bomb didn't kill him is because God had personally chosen him to rule the earth. And in that sense, the assassination attempt backfired. So they debate the fact, should you do something that's moral, even if the result is to make the situation worse?
And did Hitler literally believe that? Because there's been a lot of discussion of his religiosity or lack thereof. He certainly used religion to marshal the support. He appealed to the religious, in any religious faith in the German people, and tried to co-opt it. And the German soldiers had belt buckles that said something about God and so on. And he certainly seemed, in some sense, to have considered himself a man of destiny. In a very gruesome sense, but I've never been clear on what his actual theological beliefs were, or whether we know.
I don't think we know. The book that I would commend to your listeners is Explaining Hitler by Ron Rosenbaum, which has a chapter on what Hitler believed about religion. Rosenbaum is not conclusive about it either. Clearly, Hitler thought that Christianity was a weak religion. He actually admired Islam, and he had said, he's on the record as saying that Christianity is a religion of individualism and righteousness. Nazis have no need for that. We need Islam. That's a religion of obedience and death. Germany should be an Islamic country. And there's some thinking that he would have tried to impose that had he survived and Germany won the war. But it's also clear that after he survived the bomb, he believed in some vague self-glorifying way that God personally spared him from that explosion.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that there can be... You can believe in destiny without being theistic. I mean, Marxists clearly have a teleological view of history, or Marx himself did, but was not theistic. So is he picking up on Nietzsche there with the Christians are weak, or was that his own?
I don't know. I certainly am no expert on Hitler. I don't know whether he ever read Nietzsche or not. But that was a common thought in German society at that time, certainly.
Yeah. So in the final days in prison. What I've heard of his letters are, for one thing, a testament to the power of faith. I mean, there's, he was probably trying to keep a stiff upper lip for the purpose, for the benefit of his reading audience, which would have been his family members and a young woman he had fallen spectacularly in love with and who reciprocated the feelings, I think, so far as we know. And he was probably trying to make them, put them at ease. But he certainly sounds so stoic and untroubled.
Well, yes, he was engaged at death. He had become engaged in 1942. A lot of his letters were to his mother, and I think he knew that his mother would have wanted him to sound stoic. He wrote poetry to his mother from his cell in the concentration camp, trying to make his mother feel less bad about the situation. His mother lost her oldest son in the Great War, World War I, and then had two sons executed for opposing Hitler. And of her daughters, two of her son-in-laws were executed for opposing Hitler. So his mother went through a lot.
So how does the mechanics of this work, the situation you're in? Your agent is showing the play to theaters or to producers, or this is like having a book proposal that's being shown to publishers, I guess, right? Although
it's similar to that. Although you show a text to theatrical. Most theaters have either have a literary director or a person called a dramaturge that's in charge of reading new material. And my agent tells me they're reading this right now, so I hope that's true.
Yeah. And have you given it a title, and if so, are you wed to it, or could you be persuaded by a sufficiently persuasive producer that that if you want it produced, you have to change the name? Do you have a name for it?
If I hear that argument, I'll listen to it, but I have a title that I am wedded to. The play is called The Cup, and if you see it, you will understand why.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll remain in suspense until then. Before we go, is there anything else you want to say about him or the theology or the radicalness of the theology?
Well, just to express a general wish that there were more radicalism in Christian theology, and that there were more. I can only say this as a wish because you can't make it so. But in a lot of American history, there's been a strong left-wing Christian element in politics. And I think that's been a healthy element. Today, we've got a lot of evangelical or fundamental Christian activism in politics. And Jimmy Carter seems like a distant memory as a very devout liberal. We have a shortage of devout liberals in American society now. I think we'd have a better country if we had more of them.
Okay, and you think God is love would be a natural centerpiece of their theology?
And it may literally explain. The explanation of what God is may have been directly in front of our nose for 2,000 years. That may not be just a nice turn of the phrase. That may be a literal fact.
Mm-hmm. And what are the implications of that? I mean, does it cause you to reconceive the whole thing, so to speak? I mean, for example, Bonhoeffer was confident there would be an afterlife and he was going to heaven, right?
Yes, I'm reasonably sure that he believed that.
And sometimes liberal theology starts hedging on that, or even defining that so abstractly that it approaches the meaningless, right? So but doing that apparently is not entailed in this kind of less anthropomorphic conception of God.
I'll tell you I can only tell you what it means to me. And if God is love is the literal explanation of what God is, what that means to me is that anyone can create the most powerful force in the universe.
Well, that is reassuring, I guess. It's a kind of a. I mean, I'm thinking of it in an evolutionary context, and it is kind of an interesting thing to think in those terms, because I do think. I mean, if you accept the apparent fact that love is the feeling that accompanies altruistic, selfless behavior in animals, I think it's safe to say that love was in the cards once natural selection was set in motion, because altruism, certainly at a minimum toward offspring, was pretty much, inevitable. And it pretty naturally gets extended beyond that to collateral kin, and then the same feeling gets redeployed via romantic love. Strongly affiliative feelings can be applied beyond the family in a non-romantic context in a way that is, makes sense in terms of natural selection. So, I mean, it would, if God is love, I would say God was inherent in evolution.
And let's suppose Bonhoeffer was right. One of his final aphorisms, in the end, everything must become love. Let's suppose he was right about that. Maybe he was right about that in natural selection terms too. Maybe that's where a future, more serene society, not that you and I will ever experience, but that our children's children's children may experience, maybe that's where it's headed.
Yeah, and also that, which in turn calls to mind the theology of Teilhard de Chardin, this Catholic mystic who was himself a paleontologist, so very cognizant of evolution, but was also kind of a futurist, and saw, like 100 years ago, that, first of all, the technological infrastructure of the world was tending toward this giant global brain, which we now call the internet, and this was pretty prescient back, before the invention or at least the use of TV. But he thought that would be accompanied by the growing involvement of humankind into a common consciousness, kind of bound by love. So that was his theology. And
it sounds like some hippy-dippy thing that you would talk about in California while sipping wine and watching the sunset. What if it actually happens? What if that's where we're actually headed?
Yeah, and I think Teilhard said, God, maybe I'm wrong about this, but said God, there's a phrase in the Bible, I think God saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, and I think Teilhard said, God is more in the Omega than the Alpha. I mean, God is unfolding and maturing before our eyes, kind of, yeah.
I certainly support that, and that's the book that we mentioned early in this talk. Besides Still Waters, is largely about that question: what if God? I know you're interested in the evolution of God too, but what if God, in the spiritual and theological sense, has been evolving and changing the entire time? And the proper way to read the Bible is not of God teaching man, but the Bible is an account of man teaching God.
I'll sign up for that job.
Okay.
I'm sure he'd welcome my help, or she. Okay, well, thank you so much, Greg, and good luck with the play. We look forward to reading about it and ultimately seeing it. It's a natural. It totally is a natural.
Well, I hope you're proven correct, Bob.
Well, you can quote me if it helps, and I doubt it.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Greg.
Okay. Thank you, Bob.